Hello and welcome to this very special United Nations Association event. We're delighted that you could all join us. My name is Stuart Wood. I'm the current chair of UNA UK, and it's a pleasure for me to briefly, I promise, introduce this event, an event celebrating the UN on a very important anniversary, reflecting on the achievements and challenges of the UN and of the United Nations Association UK, and with two sadnesses associated. One is that we're meeting remotely rather than in person. We all understand why, but we all wish we weren't. And secondly, it's a chance to say farewell, a sad farewell to our CEO, UNA UK's first female chief executive, Natalie Samara Singh, who will be leaving UNA UK at the end of this week after an extraordinary 15 years of service. And more on Natalie at the end when I pop back to close the event. Today's date, 10th of January, is a special date for those of us passionate about the UN, as it is the day 76 years ago when the infant United Nations held its first ever meetings in Central Hall in Westminster here in London. Delegates to that meeting carried the hope expressed in the opening words of the Charter, words that many of us know well. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And at the same moment, thousands of people joined the newly formed UNA in the UK, as elsewhere, determined not just to support the United Nations and to win the hearts and minds of the British public to the UN, but also to ensure that UK governments of all varieties strongly supported and engaged with the UN. Now, it only needs a cursory look at the world we're in now, a world dominated by COVID, by conflict, by the threat of conflict, by growing migration, by populism, by climate change, a crisis of traditional politics. It only takes a cursory look at this world to know that these challenges, the ones that made the UN and the UNA UK necessary, have not gone away. The nature of the threats has changed, and the technological and political context of them is a world away, of course, from 1945. But the necessity of collective international coordination to tackle them has only become more rather than less acute. So the question we now face is, what does our undying commitment to a safer, fairer, more sustainable world with international cooperation at its heart, what does that commitment require of us now and in the next decade? How do we pass on a world that we're proud of rather than ashamed of to the next generation, the generation after that? And that's what today's event is going to focus on, the lessons from our past collective endeavours and recommendations for our endeavours in the next decade. And I'm glad to say we have a stellar cast lined up to discuss these issues, structured in two panel discussions involving experts from the ranks of the UN and UNA UK alike. And if other panelists who will be introduced later will forgive me, I'm especially delighted to welcome Baroness Annally, Joyce Annally, a Conservative peer, former Foreign Office Minister, who I'm really pleased to say will succeed me as chair of UNA UK later this year. But before we start the first panel, let me just introduce a short video which looks at some of the seminal moments in the history of the UN and UNA UK in particular. And just to point out one thing, you'll notice at the end of this video, there's a scene from the inauguration party organised by our colleagues in UNA Westminster to mark the fantastic success, after years of hard work, in the naming of UN Green, the area right outside of Central Hall where the inaugural meetings of the UN took place back in 1946. Congratulations and thanks to that fantastic achievement led by UNA Westminster. So I hope you enjoy the event today and look forward to your contributions as well. And I'll see you at the end to say a brief goodbye and to say a few words about Natalie. Enjoy the video. See you later.
Britain's hospitality to the 2,000 UNO visitors includes WVS hostesses. They're ready and able to fix the delegates up with anything from afternoon tea to an afternoon at the dogs. With men and women of 51 nations on the books, this is a good place to brush up on your foreign languages.
A welcome to London, this great assembly of delegates of the United Nations. We realize, as perhaps never before, a choice is offered to mankind. We must, we will succeed.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this discussion on the anniversary of the opening session of the UN General Assembly, which was held in Methodist Central Hall, Westminster on January 10th, 1946. My name is Rhiannon Nai. I am Communications Coordinator at UNA UK, and I will be stepping in for Anisa Tamori, who could not join us today. I'm delighted that we are joined this evening by two distinguished guests, Baroness Joyce Annalay and Sir Peter Marshall, as we reflect on the evolution of the UK's relationship with the UN and why the UN's mission and the wider multilateral system is still so important today. Before I introduce our speakers, a point of housekeeping. We will be inviting the audience to join an interactive Q&A session after the discussion. So please do use the Q&A function to submit any questions you have over the next 30 minutes. If your question is selected, you will then be passed the virtual mic. On to our guests. Baroness Joyce Annalay has been a member of the House of Lords since 1996. Throughout her prolific parliamentary career, Baroness Annalay has held various Conservative frontbench posts, serving as an opposition spokesperson for various departments until being appointed Opposition Chief Whip in 2007. In June 2015, she was appointed the Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, and she was appointed Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 2014. Her ministerial portfolio included the United Nations, and she worked closely with UNA UK on key initiatives such as our 1 for 7 billion campaign, combating sexual violence in conflict, UK engagement in UN peacekeeping, and more. At present, Baroness Annalay chairs the Lords International Relations and Defence Committee, and we are delighted that she'll be joining us as the first female chair of UNA UK in June. Welcome. And also our other distinguished guest this evening, Sir Peter Marshall, who we're delighted is joining us tonight, joined the UK diplomatic service in 1949, starting his career as a private secretary to the British ambassador in Washington. After rising to become Economic Undersecretary in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Sir Peter was the Deputy Economics and Social Affairs to Britain's Permanent Representative to the UN in New York. Subsequently, he was appointed as UK Permanent Representative to the UN in Geneva, serving between 1979 to 1983. Notably, following this, Sir Peter spent more than 2 decades working on Commonwealth affairs, notably as Commonwealth Deputy Secretary General, and then Chairman of the Joint Commonwealth Societies Council until 2003. Sir Peter is the author of Public Diplomacy and continues to write extensively on issues relating to the UN and multilateralism more broadly. So it's a pleasure to welcome you both this evening. Hello, and let's just jump straight into questions, because I'm sure everyone tonight would be delighted to hear from you both.
Thank you very much.
So to start off, Sir Peter, I'd like to ask you the first question, and then Baroness will go on to you with the same one. How has the UK's relationship with the UN evolved over the last 76 years? And in your opinion, what are the key examples of joint successes that could be replicated today?
2 very good questions. I think you need a book to answer each of them. But in very short terms, I think we have all understood that the experiment launched in 1945 has been a colossal success. In 1945, there were 50 members of the UN. There are now 193. There are now 3 times as many people on the earth as there were then. And the average lot of the average member of the human race is infinitely better than it was now. So that the verdict, how has it evolved? The answer is very well indeed. And of course, when the 193 present members got together in the commemorative declaration of 21st September last year, they said, we want more of the same. And they used for the first time in official language the word multilateralism. They said multilateralism is not an option, it is a necessity. In other words, the way in which we work together, think together, hope together, is what is going to make the difference in tackling these enormous problems that face us.
That's wonderful, especially what you said about hope. I think that's a really important sentiment tonight. Baroness Annalie, could we have your take on the same question? What are the key examples of joint successes between the UK and the UN, and how could they be replicated?
Well, to start off with, thank you very much indeed for your introduction. And Sir Peter hit the nail on the head when he said that really successes are where we work together. And if I can just give a couple of examples of those, against the background that the UN has had to adapt to a very changing, shifting world in the way that conflict takes place. Having been formed after the Second World War, that generation could not have foreseen that today we would be facing not only a global pandemic, but we would see a marked increase in violence by non-state actors. And we'd see so much evidence of hybrid warfare as well. So against that background, a couple of examples of where I think the UK has worked successfully with the UN. The first is one of these geeky things that really matters. When I was a minister for the UN at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as it was then, we came to an agreement with the United Nations Statistics Division that we would work together to conduct a project with each other that actually supported 20 countries across Africa and Asia, strengthening their capacity in compiling and using the data that was needed to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals were more than just hot air. They were really going to be put into effect so that politicians such as me couldn't just make statements, that we would be testing how those statements were being born into practice. And as that developed, from then, of course, when we hit the pandemic, it was adjusted to ensure that the statistics with regard to the impact of the pandemic on countries could be taken into account. And that project has lasted 3 years and has had some important results. But the other example I'd like to give briefly is one to which you referred earlier on, Rihanna, and that is that when I was at the Foreign Office, I was asked to continue the work of William Hague in leading the UK's initiative on preventing sexual violence in conflict. And to do that, we had to work hand in glove with the UN on their excellent work on the eradication of violence against women. And as I left the Foreign Office, I'm pleased to say that Tariq Ahmad, Lord Ahmad of Wimbledon, took on that and has provided excellent leadership. This coming summer, he will be hosting an international conference of ministers. And what he's doing is, again, not having just hot air, he's going to measure what's been done and what needs to be done and hold them to account. So when you work together internationally, you can make a difference. It's tough, and working in a consensual way can take many hours of negotiation, but boy, it's worth it.
Indeed. So my next question is about kind of the mission of multilateralism and the UN. So you've both had personal, professional journeys that are deeply linked to this mission. Can you please talk about why is the UN still important for the UK? And I think you've already started speaking about this, but how can the UK support the UN and our international rules-based system more widely and more effectively in the face of the new global challenges we face today?
Again, a very good question. The answer, the first part of it really comes from what Lady Annalie was saying, that we've got there, you have to think in what faces in the world, everything from the most detailed questions like statistics to prevention of war. And in other words, you have to equip yourself with a zoom lens. And as far as we're concerned, Britain is a country which is more internationally involved than almost any other, considering various aspects of, like exactly the size, location, and so on. And we have a greater stake in a peaceable world than anybody else. And of course, over history, we've had a good deal of experience in contributing to it. Now, I wouldn't suggest that any specific measure in the future, because the future is so uncertain. We have this extraordinary trio of climate change, a pandemic, and a whole raft of social economic problems, which we're just beginning to get an understanding of as we emerge from the worst of the pandemic. So that again, the answer is always, diplomats always answer these things, the situation is rather fluid. When a diplomat doesn't understand a situation, he or she says, the situation is fluid. The situation is fluid.
And why is the UN important to the UK? Because the UK is one of those 193 countries that has a voice. And I think for me, what's so special about the UN is that every country has a voice. And it means that it's not a case that, as in some regional organisations, there's a weighted amount of votes to a particular country. When you're in the General Assembly, there's one vote, and that's your lot. And I think that the credibility the UN gets as a result of that is it acts as a linchpin for our rules-based international order, and that is key to UK foreign policy. It's in our interests that that is maintained. And of course, when we come to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, when their views align, the Security Council plays an indispensable role in promoting peace and security and preventing war. I think there's also a particular legitimacy the UN bestows when it speaks on an issue of global concern. Sometimes very difficult to achieve agreement, and there might be questions later on about what happens when there is disagreement. But overall, the UN has survived in 3/4 of a century because it doesn't give up. It doesn't give up giving a voice to everybody. And that's important to every one of the 193 countries.
I think this would be an excellent moment then to talk about your own involvement in the UN. Can you both tell us about your work and your involvement with the UN over the years? So Peter, could we perhaps start with you?
You should never ask a diplomat to reminisce. I think it should be considered to be an indictable offence for anybody of my great antiquity to talk about the past. But anyway, I began, I think the first time I went to the UN was as an assistant private secretary to the Anthony Eden, who was then the foreign secretary. I didn't think he needed an assistant private secretary in addition to those already around him, and I proved right in that case. But it did give me a marvelous opportunity to look at the UN and at New York generally. I was at that time the most junior and useless member of the embassy in Washington, so I could be spared from Washington to help. But since then, I have had 3 stages. The first was as the deputy in Geneva, when de Gaulle was keeping us out of the EU. Then the second time was, I then had a lot to do with the UN in London when I was the economic undersecretary, and particularly the pressure of the developing countries for what they call a new international economic order. In other words, they wanted the playing field to be more level than it was. And we used to talk about the Group of 77 and the Third World Coalition, which Mark particularly knows a great deal about. Then when I went to New York, I again specialized on this area. But my final involvement with the UN was in Geneva again, where by this time we'd moved on from the concentration on economic order and the emphasis on social, the social benefits that could be brought to people, especially through a holistic approach right across the board, of which Lady Anne was just talking. The three great areas of our activity in the UN are peace and security, human rights, and development. Now, that's a bit of an arbitrary division, and of course they interrelate. The second thing is, of course, that not only does the subject interrelate, but the places in which they are discussed interrelate. And the way in which we discuss them gives us insights into our interrelationships. And the most important of these in this context is the Commonwealth. But we're talking a moment about the UN.
And so Peter, you're saying about it should be entitled Events Really to Reminisce. My goodness, that opening video, I'm afraid, made me reminisce, because when I saw the pictures of the Central Hall, Westminster, it made me think of my first ever visit there. And it wasn't at that time, but it was 28 years later. I was just about to go to university. And it was the first civil society meeting I'd ever attended in my life, hosted, of course, by the UN on 10th of January in the freezing cold there. And I came away with my eyes opened about what could be done by people working together worldwide. My father had fought in the Second World War, my grandfather in the First World War, and I was very skeptical about whether whether we could avoid future conflict. I went away feeling that it was absolutely vital that civil society should raise its voice. And I spent quite a lot of years working through civil society. So my second phase in Parliament from 1996 was to use my voice there on behalf of members of civil society. And then the third phase was as a minister for the UN when I was at the Foreign Office. And I learned a lot from the diplomats then about how to keep their blood pressure down when it seemed that we politicians could disagree on some of the most minute matters of detail until we finally came to an agreement. So I learned a lot from that, but I found it fascinating. It was really the greatest privilege to be able to do that. And now I have a chance to look at the UN through a different prism by gathering evidence. As chair of our Select Committee on International Relations and Defence, I'm able to ensure that we see how the UN is functioning, how it's viewed by its customers, every single person around the world. Our current inquiry is about the United Nations Commission on the Law of the Seas. And we're posing ourselves the question, is the convention fit for purpose in the 21st century? Well, we'll have to wait and see what we think, but not for long. Our report's going to be published just next month.
Ah. Yes.
That is certainly something we will be looking forward to. I also really think your comments on civil society are so important and very much something we at UNA UK have been looking and thinking and talking about very loudly, especially over the last few years. And it brings me on to kind of my last question before we open it to everyone at home. Why should people in the UK care about the UN? And then importantly, how can they get involved?
Yes, well, I think the answer was given by this famous parliamentarian, Edmund Burke. And he said that all that is necessary for evil to triumph is that good people should do nothing. Now, that has probably always been true up to a certain point, but it has never been truer than it is now when we are so interdependent right across the world. And again, listening to what Lady Anne is saying, it is we're in the middle of a situation which has never been encountered before, and we haven't yet got perhaps the ability to find the right toolbox to deal with all of this, because we don't actually know what it is we've got to be working on. We've got to keep an absolutely open mind. My slogan, if you're permitted, is that capability is our compass and multilateralism is our lodestar. And the simple answer to the question of why could the UK be involved is that we would be in very great trouble if we weren't involved. But may I add one thing before the end? You've been very kind so far, not referring to my great antiquity. But the most important vital statistic, as far as I'm concerned, is that I have earned, I have drawn my modest diplomatic service pension for 4 years longer than I spent earning it.
And following Sir Peter, I agree with everything he said. And for me, what you've been saying, Sir Peter, points exactly to the way why it's so important that people in the UK should care about the UN, because it's about their future. And the UN has shown that it can create future stability amidst the most appalling challenges. It can find a way through. And in an era when we've seen that not only the pandemic affecting health, but affecting everybody's way of life, it's led to greater levels of violence against women and girls. It's led to far greater inequalities on access to education, to the economy, to having a job, let alone access to health. So for the future of current generations and their future generations, that's why they should be interested in making sure the UN is there and it works for them. And how can perhaps they get involved? Well, I can give an example of why perhaps joining UNA UK is a good idea. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I can give a practical example. When I was a minister, I was made absolutely aware of the strength of feeling across all the membership of UNA UK about having the hustings for the selection of what was then going to be Antonio Guterres, but the next Secretary General after Ban Ki-moon. And I can tell you, that kind of tsunami of opinion has an impact on policy for the better.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much. I'm now going to open up the session to questions from everyone at home. So please, if you haven't already entered a question, please do, everyone. It would be wonderful to hear your voices. And again, a reminder how this is going to work is I will read out your question, or if not, what will happen is I'll read out your name and you will appear on screen to ask your question. So let's get started. So we have a question from David Meller. Is David Meller ready to? Oh, I see David Meller is now up. Here's a question on the TPNW. David, you're now unmuted. I think you can speak. If you'd like to ask your question. I think, hello? Oh. So I think he's about to join as a panelist just momentarily. So in the meantime, just going to wax lyrical a little bit more about the mission of the UN and just how wonderful it is to hear from you both on that perspective. David, hello.
David.
Hello.
If you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm involved in the nuclear disarmament movement, very much enthused by the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, 22nd of January last year. would be very interested in the panelists' advice on how we can try to move that treaty on, particularly in this country.
Well, I'm not sure whether I'm quite the right person to end the discussion, so I'll begin it. I mean, the question, the nuclear thing, is of course absolutely the key issue here. What is interesting, incidentally, when you go back to 1945 with the signature of the charter, that was it ended after VE Day, but before VJ Day. We'd already decided that this was the way to get on with the situation, even the expectation that it would take another 18 months for after the defeat of Germany to secure the defeat of Japan. Now, the dropping of the nuclear bomb has made that altered that situation dramatically. But of course, it did introduce into world affairs the dropping of nuclear bombs, which has been a preoccupation ever since. But I would have thought rather interesting as to what exactly your take is on this, because in a way, what we're up against is not the sense that we can see the scope for agreement and recognize its benefits, but we're not prepared to give up the security of having something which we've got available for use in difficult circumstances. And I would have said that on the whole, the UN surely has succeeded rather well in limiting the extent to which nuclear arms are now available. And the treaty, of course, is very much part of that. But I mean, that is, as it were, that's a question which is answering your question with another question.
Well, Peter, I think you set the scene very well indeed, given the context. And clearly, it's a very relevant question at the moment. It always is, but particularly now timely, because the review conference is now kicking off in New York, and having been delayed because of the constraints caused by COVID. I represented the UK at the last RevCon in 2015. And what struck me very forcibly then was that the UN is certainly the vehicle through which agreement can be reached, not to increase the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons. And I was therefore pleased to see the joint communique that went out with the UK government just last week, I think it was, where they espoused again the statement that a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. And it's against that background that I would take about what you said about how can we get that across in the country. I think that's really always the way I approach it, because I think in those terms. And just before Christmas, we had the Select Committee on International Relations Defence had a briefing meeting, a private briefing meeting with James Cleverly about the RevCon. Now, although it's private, I'm allowed to say that I did raise issues about how you work with the proponents of the TPNW. And my view, I can say outside that meeting, so it's on the record, my view is that it's absolutely crucial for the UK government to show that it's really engaging with civil society when the discussions are going on in New York, and to understand better where the forcefulness has come from about the signatures reaching the critical level for the TPNW, not being dismissive, but working with those who've put forward those ideas, because it's only by doing that that we can better understand the reasons for each other's point of view. And that's what the UN is very good at. So I should be looking very carefully to see just what the UK delegation to New York does. And I hope that they are going to ensure that they do find out more about TPNW and really engage with civil society on this?
Can I come in? I think this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, the first time that we really thought there was a danger of use of nuclear weapons was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963. And then the word was talked about MAD, mutually assured destruction. Now, it seems to me that everybody has got the message now that that's not a very sensible way of conducting our interdependent affairs. But do you see, in other words, behind all this is an instinctive recoil from doing something that's going to have this colossal damage? At the moment, if you limit the use to a certain number of powers, it's the militarization of nuclear weapons that is really the difficulty that we've got to avoid, isn't it?
Thank you both very much, and thank you, David, for your question. I'm going to now bring on another person to ask questions. I'm conscious of time. This next question is from Ambassador Joseph Mutaboba, who's former PR for Rwanda. Ambassador, welcome.
Now, with your picture.
Yes, yeah.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Well, thanks a lot, and happy and prosperous new 2022 to everybody. I just wanted to ask a question to Sir Peter Marshall regarding the multilateralism. I have observed, and I'm observing even today, that multilateralism is dying, especially in Europe. What is your view on this, and what do you advise?
So, what was dying, you said?
Multilateralism.
Yeah, I'm not sure I get that. I'm sorry, I don't get the point.
We talked of multilateralism.
Multilateralism. Multilateralism is dying.
Yes, bringing us to work and think together. It looks as if it's dying in Europe.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wonder, is that, I'm not sure whether that's, this is the sort of situation where it's extremely difficult to assess exactly what's happening. I mean, you can, various points of view are put forward very convincingly, which don't necessarily hang together. I would have thought that overall, that after a period, in the case of Europe, that while we've been examining the nitty-gritty of actually the ceasing to be a membership, full membership of the EU, that this somehow is being replaced by a realization of the problems of climate change and the pandemic, and say the whole massive economic and social issues that are building up as a result of them, and a lot of them would have been there before anyway, is tending, and I use the word very carefully, tending to diminish, as it were, the feelings of a split of opinion. Now, I may be wrong about that. I may be rather, I'm always told I'm optimistic. I don't mind, as an Austrian friend of mine used to say, I'm always an optimist. Sometimes I'm a depressed optimist.
Thank you.
I'm not sure the answer to the question. I'm not sure I got it right yet.
Well, it can do just right.
I think that one of the rather glib comments that was made by somebody about 10 years ago, not me this time, but was multilateralism is what you want it to be. And what they really meant was that it's survived as long as it has because somehow countries find a way when they get into the General Assembly in New York, they find a way of being able to put forward the benefits that will come to their own country. They see a selfish interest, which can sometimes then be used to bring countries together. And I think that the pandemic has really brought that about. And I very much find when I'm talking to people outside Parliament, not just politicians, but real people outside Parliament, they're talking about the need for the UK to ensure that we're not just taking the steps ourselves to have vaccinations, but that we're providing them for the wider community as well, particularly, in fact, for countries in Africa where the uptake has been very, very low so far. So it's actually, I think, you're right to raise it, very much right to raise it. But I do think that there is still a positive way forward for multilateralism, despite some of the, if you look at the graph, the spikes in graphs when individual interests seem to dominate the local papers.
That's very true. Thank you.
Can I come back on this? Jean Monnet used to say that institutions don't change human nature, but they make people behave better. And that's what you're saying. It is once you get inside. I'm conscious of this myself. In the great in New York or Geneva, you just do behave a little bit better than you might have done otherwise.
That's very true.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to bring up another person to ask a question now. Nina Yordanova, I think so. Nina has a question about kind of strategic priorities. Hi, Nina.
Nina, yeah.
Good evening to you all. I've been inspired by your discussion and just wanted to very openly ask you what should be the UN's and UNA UK's most important strategic priorities ahead?
Yes, this is always very difficult, isn't it? The strategic priorities. One of the problems is, of course, that the whole of economics and politics is about the allocation of time or energy or resources to competing ends or purposes. And whatever strategic priority you choose, there is, as the economists say, an opportunity cost that somebody else may lose out. Now, if in the present circumstances, can we say in very general terms what our priorities are? I think again, as a diplomat, you will find a way of dodging the question. But I think that what is true is that that people count, and that the issues not simply of human rights, but of human welfare, probably should take as much priority as they can in relation to these more general issues of policy, such as development or international relations. But this is again, let's say, if you don't like the answer, I'm prepared to withdraw it.
Well, certainly I agree with you, Sir Peter, and I certainly am concerned about the way in which some of the power blocks have started to shrink in amongst them, upon themselves, because I think that we should be using the crisis of the pandemic to think more in terms of what benefits everybody, not just what benefits our own country. We shouldn't be panicking. And I think that, and I would say this, wouldn't I, as a person in the UK, I do think that the government here has been trying not to panic and has been trying to plot a path forward whereby the UK can protect its own population, but do so in a way that also uses overseas aid to help others. And what I would like to see is more agreement around the world about how the various types of vaccine are used across the pandemic, so that we can ensure that we are levelling up around the world. And I think that it's one of those things where a great challenge like this pandemic can be used in a way that will end up with countries working better together. But then I've always been the optimist, and I refuse to become a pessimist. I'm not going to go down that. I keep trying, come what may. But what a very, very, very good question, and one that is a challenge for all of us in decision making.
Thank you very much.
I think we could all do with a healthy dose of optimism, so I'm very glad for it, Baroness. I'm just going to ask, I think we have time for one last question. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ewan Grant, who has worked in UNDP programs alongside various UN bodies in post-conflict countries. Ewan, if you're there, please come on up. We see.
There we are, unmuted now. Sorry about the bit of a problem with my camera. My question is quite a simple one, but perhaps not the easiest to answer. China is moving and looks to be becoming the world's most powerful nation, or at least a full peer competitor to the United States. China is not a liberal democracy. I have photos on my phone which demonstrate the consequences of that. How is the UN going to deal with that likely reality, and how should bodies such as UNA UK just deal with that? Thank you.
I go first. Yes.
Yes.
Napoleon said, "Let China sleep. When she awakes, the world will be sorry." And 200 years later, we're seeing it. Now, the question is, though, that at the moment, let us look at the statistics. China represents about 17% of world GNP, America 24%, countries like Germany 3%, Russia 2%. And before we think that they are the most terrifying creatures there have ever been, it's worth wondering whether if the other 82% got together and sort of said, well, this is quite a problem, what would happen? You see, we look at a situation, we are bemused. We have been bemused over the past 2 or 3 years by the rise of China, which I suggest to you has been a function of the lack of understanding and unity and collective cooperation among the rest of the world. If NATO had not been suffered a fairly grievous blow by the work of President Trump in particular, would that have happened? The answer, I believe, is no. It's like the weather. There's high pressure and low pressure. And where there isn't high pressure, there is low pressure, and even more the other way around. Where there's low pressure, that's where the trouble is likely to occur. So then I think the answer to your question is simply that we should be ourselves. It's not the question we've got to evolve a policy towards you, China, because you're the greatest threat in the world. What we're saying is 84% of the world, 83% of the world's GNP is going ahead in a situation of mutual understanding and of a persuasion that by working together, you get better results. If you, China, are of a different persuasion, let's discuss the matter. Meanwhile, let us not forget that China, as among the 193 countries which signed the commemorative declaration, which embraced all the benefits of cooperation and the tenets of good behavior that arise from the UN Charter.
And yet again, I find myself agreeing with Sir Peter. I think against the background of the United Nations, we find ourselves in a position where their power balances change. It doesn't mean to say that they go completely out of kilter, but historically they do change. And we've seen the way in which China has not only been developing its own economic heft and wanting to keep at home its own production processes rather than having it overseas. So it's focusing far more internally than it has in the past. But it's also still very much takes seriously its membership of the United Nations. And I think that's where there can be a continuing dialogue with China about how they can continue to be a respected country around the world, whilst also contravening some of the most basic human rights issues that in the United Nations we take not only seriously, but so seriously. And therefore, I think the United Nations has an invaluable role to play in ensuring that as China continues its economic growth, because it will, that as it continues its economic growth, it still sees, understands the value of it being a practical and respected member of the United Nations. And I think that's a role that the UK can play very strongly indeed.
Thank you, Baroness. Thank you, Ewan, for your question. And thank you, Sir Peter. I think that about takes up all our time for this session. And so I just want to say thanks once again for a wonderful and informative conversation. And just to say to everyone at home, we will now be clearing the Q&A box ahead of the next session, but thank you for all of you that submitted questions. And if your question was not answered just now, we'll endeavour to follow up on them after the event. Next up, on to the next part of the event. I will be signing off now.
We the peoples.
We the peoples.
We the people.
We the peoples of the United Nations.
Determined.
We the peoples of the United Nations determined.
Determined to save
Succeeding generations.
Determined to save succeeding generations
from the scourge of war.
And to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights.
Fundamental human rights.
In the dignity and worth
of the human person.
The dignity and worth of the human person.
In the equal rights of men and women.
Of men and women.
In the equal rights of men and women.
And of nations large and small.
And to establish conditions under which justice and respect.
Justice and respect
can be maintained.
To promote social progress.
Social progress.
And to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom.
To practice tolerance
and live together in peace.
To practice tolerance and live together in peace.
To unite our strength.
To unite our strength to maintain international peace and security.
To promote the economic and social advancement of all peoples.
Of all peoples.
Of all peoples.
We the peoples
have resolved
To combine our efforts.
to combine our efforts.
To accomplish these aims.
to accomplish these aims.
To accomplish these aims.
Good evening. I believe that we're ready to start with the second panel. So good evening, everybody. My name is Dali Tenhove. I work as a reporting officer in MONUSCO, the UN peace operation in the DR Congo. It's my great pleasure to be a part of this panel this evening and to moderate this with two fascinating guests. The first is Lord Mark Malek Brown, who is the president of the Open Society Foundation and a patron of UNA UK. He's had a truly remarkable, extraordinary, exceptional career within the UN and outside. So I'm not going to enumerate all his various roles. It would take the entire panel. But let me just mention some highlights. He was the Deputy Secretary General, and before that, the Chief of Staff under former late Secretary General Kofi Annan. And he has also served as the administrator of UNDP, the UN Development Programme, one of the UN system's preeminent agencies. Our other great guest is Natalie Samara Singh, who, as we all know, is the departing Chief Executive Officer of UNA UK. She's been with the organization for some 15 years in a variety of different roles. And I think it's incumbent to mention that in her time as CEO, she has really done some extraordinary work for UNA UK, putting it on the map regarding reform efforts at the highest echelons of the organization, notably through the 147 billion and Together First campaigns. Natalie also took some sabbaticals while with UNA UK to serve as the chief speechwriter of the President of the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, and as the chief of strategy of the UN's 75th anniversary initiative. So this session is due to last for about 50 minutes. For the first half or so, I'll be asking some questions to our panelists, and thereafter we'll take questions from all the guests here, just like the previous panel. So you're all very much encouraged to ask some questions and to do so on a rolling basis through this discussion, as I'll be taking more questions at a time. So the first question that I'd like to ask of Natalie and Mark, if I may use your first name, has to do with some of the great geopolitical fault lines that we can see emerge today and which we can expect to play a very significant roles as the century moves forward. We all know that the first half century or so of the UN was marked by the geopolitical fault line between the US and the Soviet Union. And today we see something slightly similar beginning to emerge, namely through the Cold War style rivalry between the United States and China. So that is quite likely, I would say, one of the great fault lines that will define at least a big chunk of this century. And related to that, another fault line has to do with this competition between democracy and authoritarianism, which we could say is almost an offshoot of this Sino-American rivalry. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, how do you see these forces condition geopolitics and the UN's role in helping the international community deliver global public goods? And if I could start, I'd like to begin asking that question to Natalie.
Thanks so much, Dali, and thanks again for moderating this as well. I think I've known you for most of my time at UNA, and I've learned a lot from you and from Mark, of course. I think you both have that same combination of sort of unshakable faith in the mission of the UN, but very sharp realism on its prospects. So thank you, and Mark. Of course, thanks so much for taking part in my final event. I think I joined UNA just as you were leaving the UN. And it's been a real privilege to sort of support, to have your support and to be able to conspire with you over the years. I look forward to doing a lot more of that when I join you at the Open Society Foundations. And I realize this is probably the last time ever I'll be able to disagree with you in public before I take up my new role. So I'll do as much of that as I can today. Dali, to your question, I mean, I think it's a great question, but I'm a little bit wary of trying to organize the world according to grand themes. I mean, I studied history, so I do that a lot. But I think that while it can, make for a good discussion, good communications, it can sometimes stifle us when it comes to policy making. One of the big challenges I've seen and changes, I think, in my 15 years at UNA is the pace, the intensity, the sheer number of crises that have emerged. It's been relentless for policymakers. I think Sir Peter used the expression, the situation is fluid. I mean, it feels like everything's been fluid over the past years. And I think that makes us sometimes fall back on narratives that we find familiar. And I noticed you nuanced, the expression Cold War to Cold War style. But I think, sometimes that kind of thinking leads to a sort of black and white approach to policy making. It's very hard to deal with complexity under pressure. Nuance is difficult. It's probably why UNA doesn't, do media sound bites and is in the headlines. And I think at the UN too, we're sort of quite comfortable with the big power narrative because we have a response to that. Those are the targets. That's how we have to focus our advocacy. Those are the solutions that we can apply. But I think it's much harder than that now because there aren't just two superpowers. I think the world is much more multipolar, it's much more polarized, sort of within and between countries. And if you look at the levers of power today, I think you have information and technology almost up there, alongside economic and military power. And that is much more democratized. I mean, there are lots of countries that have those tools. And indeed, in those areas, but also others, I don't think you would even say that states are the only powers. I mean, there are companies and, and others that have the same influence. And in much the same way, I don't think democracy and autocracy are really defined opposites now, if they ever were. To someone, from the developing world, someone who spent most of their life, I think as an immigrant, I have a very different perspective on which countries are the traditional defenders of democracy. I come from Sri Lanka, where minorities have suffered atrocities for a long time. So I sort of feel very strongly that holding elections doesn't necessarily make, a democracy. So in short, I think we're in a very messy situation, and that's had a big impact on the UN, which is a traditional organization. It's based on states. It operates on the basis of regional groups. These labels have become much more blurred and less meaningful, but the practices are very, very hard to change. So now I think you have to sort of almost build coalitions issue by issue. It's very, very hard work. I'm not sure the UN has been allowed to develop the kind of advocacy capacity that would enable it to do that work. And I think there's, also just so much scope for the UN to do more in engaging with actors that aren't governments. I know it does so a lot, much more than it used to, but often that engagement is very ad hoc, it's piecemeal. Sometimes it seems to be quite tick box or performative. Sometimes it engages in partnerships without really looking at issues such as transparency and accountability. So, I was pleased to see Secretary General Guterres, talk about the need for more intentional, inclusive and network multilateralism. And I hope that's something that will really be taken forward in the coming years.
Mark, do you have anything to add?
Well, as always, Natalie gave a very, very complete answer, but I think it is the case that China is asserting itself at the UN. I think now Chinese nationals lead two of the major specialized agencies, one in agriculture, one in information technology. They've created a trust fund to support the Office of the Secretary General and are pushing for Chinese nationals across a range of jobs. But equally, that, in a sense, is correcting a historic imbalance. They were very underrepresented given the size of China in the world. And so, you've got to put some of this down to the fact they've taken advantage of a period of American somnolence, if one can put it that way, when, President Trump pretty much lost interest in the UN and where it created a tactical opportunity for China to sort of push up its representation. And so in itself, I don't think it's necessarily bad, but there is, of course, an issue of Chinese values rubbing up against the UN Charter. And one can either dismiss the UN Charter as a very Western document in need of broadening, or one can say that actually it does have a claim to universality, its protection as for human rights, for self-determination, for the sovereignty of peoples, are universal calls that should override east, west, north, south, and be something that, the world can combine around. And, I do think that in areas like human rights, we're going to see, in this rebalancing of power at the UN, something of a move away from the focus on individual human rights towards an agenda at times of more collective human rights. I mean, China has an extraordinary track record to point to of, poverty reduction in recent decades, and, is much stronger ground to stand on there than around individual rights, where the conditions of the Uyghur or the circumstances today in Hong Kong, are terrible black marks against modern China. So, the UN has never been immune to these sort of outside forces. And so, whether it is that recalibration of US-China power, or as Natalie says, the rise of civil society, the rise of other non-state actors, the UN is ultimately a porous political system, which holds a mirror up to the world it represents and reflects that world, for better or worse. And, I was just very struck at the beginning, comparing the video of Attlee opening the first General Assembly to that video of We the People's, just, shot when Natalie was running the UN75 a year back, or 2 years back. This is a totally different UN. Its sense of who its stakeholders are, its sense of its priorities have gone from, it's more than just film is no longer grey and monochrome and black and white. It's the sort of modern diversity of who the UN considers its, if you like, its stakeholders, its caseload, its priorities, has moved forward. And that's, that's very exciting. It's problematic as to how to help such a range of people on such a range of issues. But, it is a UN trying its best to kind of keep up with changes in the world.
Great. Well, the next thing that I'd like to discuss with both of you has to do with something that I personally call the UN's a public convening power. So when we talk about the United Nations and what it brings, what its value added is to the world, we often say that the UN has convening power. It has the ability to bring state leaders from all across the world together in one room in the General Assembly Hall or around tables in Geneva to discuss issues of common concern. It seems to be the case, though, that increasingly it's been hard to translate this convening power into actual outcomes. We still have leaders come to the General Assembly. They still make some grand speeches. They still recommit themselves unshakably to the Charter. And yet, when it comes down to really resolving something, real impactful outcomes seem to be more and more elusive. So personally, I think that has to do with the lack of public convening power. There is less interest and knowledge today, I think, in the UN than there's ever been before. And as a result, the pressure is off leaders to actually really do something. And if anything, sometimes if they sign on to a treaty or whatnot, that can have poor repercussions for them in their domestic political situations, while there's not really many benefits domestically to being an internationalist. So what I want to ask you is, what do you think of public perceptions of the UN nowadays? And how do you think that public disinterest, if indeed you agree that there is public disinterest around the world, how do you think that this disinterest can hamper the UN? I'll start with Mark, and actually, Mark, if I can also ask you, it'd be great if you could approach the mic slightly. I think your sound quality would be better.
Okay, great. Well, let's hope that's clearer. Look, I mean, Natalie will give you some figures from the UN at 75, where there was some research on global attitudes towards the UN. But there's no doubt the UN is not, you know, to the extent it's popular, it's a very thin popularity, and it's more about the idea of the UN than the practice or performance of the UN. And it tends to be, you know, very sliced by age. Young people, at least until recently, still had a fair degree of enthusiasm for the organization. Much older people had a degree of enthusiasm because they remember back to its founding and its ambitions. But in the middle are, you know, the working generations, if you like, who, you know, dismiss it as probably a call on their taxes and, you know, as not contributing much to make their lives better. And, you know, even amongst young people, I've noticed when I kind of give talks in places that, you know, there's a lot more anger now amongst young people, particularly coming from developing countries who no longer view the UN as this sort of, you know, aspirational presence in their countries, but are in many cases very angry about what they see as corruption in the UN, etc. So, you know, there's no way around it. The UN standing is diminished and tarnished versus some earlier points in its history. But I would also say it's not new for that to happen. You know, there were long Cold War periods where the same thing was true. The UN was dismissed as not having fixed the world's problems, as irrelevant. And it's sort of, it hangs on and comes back. And indeed, you know, the UN has lived most of its life in periods of, you know, really sort of diminished standing in the world because the world's been divided. The good periods, and I was lucky enough to be Deputy Secretary General and had other jobs under Kofi Annan, was probably during his Secretary Generalship, where he was lucky enough to coincide with a post-Cold War period when there was extraordinary sort of aspirational ambition in all corners of the world to find multilateral solutions to problems. But for most of the UN's existence, that's been the exception, not the rule.
If I can also... Oh,
sorry, go ahead, Dali. It's your show, please.
I just wanted to add, you know what, Mark, something that has stayed with me over a number of years is something that you said when you gave your gorgeous eulogy of Kofi Annan at Central Hall, Westminster, a few years ago. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was sufficiently memorable to stick in my mind over these years. You said something about how the UN was going through a long winter. I think you were speaking in the backdrop of the war in Syria, which the UN tragically has not been able to make any real progress towards resolving. But you said that yes, there have been winters in the UN before, and for all we know, there will be some brightness soon enough in the future. And that is, I mean, it's good to you know, as a relatively still young person in the UN system, it's good to have something to look forward to potentially in the future, even if the organization at the moment is not as grand as we would like it to be. But sorry, Natalie, please continue.
No, I was going to just come in and say that I think Kofi had a particular, you know, kind of fortuitous set of circumstances and obviously, you know, a great team. But I think he also took the opportunity, you know. I've done a lot of polling, as you said, Mark, on the UN, both at the UN and for UNA. And, you know, one thing that never fails to surprise me and sort of upset me a little bit is Kofi Annan is still the most common answer to who is the Secretary General of the UN. You know, decades on, we asked that question, you know, 2 years ago. And he's still the one that people remember. And he had a way, I think, of storytelling and of connecting that I think we've lost a little bit now. I think the UN as an institution is sort of fixated on, you know, social media as one way. I think it does, you know, a great job. But I think it's about those connections with the communities that where something has been lost. And I do hope that, that's something that UNA will continue to work on going forward. I think, Dali, your question on public disinterest, I think yes, of course it is the case. UNA has spent a lot of time, I think, trying to figure out how to balance this narrative, I think, of either the UN as a total bit player, a bystander shouting from the sidelines, a failed organization, or an organization that has changed the world, protected millions, saved millions of lives, helped to create, laws, norms, standards. I think created this expectation that we should have an international community that should deal with crises. And I think it's been a victim of its success in that sense. But we've always had this sort of issue, I think, that critics fear the UN as a world government and enthusiasts sort of wish it were. But I think that, I guess there are three levels. I think, the brand recognition of the UN is still very high. You go to any part of the world, you hail a cab, you hail a tuk-tuk, and you tell people you work for the UN or UNA, and my God, cab drivers, tuk-tuk drivers, people at hot dog stands, etc., they have strong views about the UN. And I'm always, almost sort of impressed at the sort of level of knowledge that people, particularly in lots of developing countries, will have on, what's happening at the UN, etc. I've often found it's people in this country, in sort of private sector roles, etc., who maybe have kind of less knowledge of, the day-to-day goings on of the UN. But the brand recognition is there. And I think, weirdly enough, the perceptions are generally quite positive in terms of the UN having an essential role. We polled about 1.5 million people in every UN member state for the UN75, and it got a sort of approval rating, as it were, of about kind of 74%, saying it is essential. But then when you start drilling down beyond that top line of its mission, there's a huge gap between what people think the UN should deliver and what it should be doing, and what they actually feel it is delivering. And you have certain countries like the Republic of Korea, where there's strong approval and they see the UN as really kind of, intimately associated with their country's success. And then you have other countries where, especially where the UN is operating, where there might have been issues of, sexual harassment and abuse or corruption, or, or sort of some perceived privilege or gap between the UN staff and the public. And you have those feelings come up. But still, there's general approval, even in countries where you wouldn't expect it, like the US, for the UN. So I think the perceptions issue is a mixed bag. I think the thing that worries me the most is disinterest. I think that's the one that's really difficult, because it's linked to this general sense of distrust in institutions and in leaders and in politicians. And I think it's really dangerous, because I think governments, the UN, you can sort of go through the motions and sort of say, okay, people don't really engage with us, but it's all right. When we ask them, they say we generally do a good job or whatever. And then something hits, whether that's a pandemic or a crisis, etc. And you need trust, you need people to do something. And UNA has made that point time and again in the UK in relation to its security strategies, so you sort of can't leave public engagement out on key questions about foreign policy and then turn to them when there's a crisis and say, please support this action. And we also make that point, I think, more generally about the UN, to politicians, to media, to other NGOs, that the UN isn't just something that happens in September or these big set piece events. It's something you have to keep working at. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges for the UN, and what UNA will no doubt continue working on. It's sort of shoring up that constant feedback loop between the local, national, regional, and global that needs to be in place for things to move ahead.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I think then one more question from me, and then we'll turn to questions from participants. So please, I see there's only a few questions in the chat so far. So please, everybody, any thoughts that occur to your mind, please put it in there. Well, not any thoughts, but interesting ones. One more question then. So 10 days ago, Secretary General Guterres began his second 5-year term. And quite interestingly, his second term promises to be somewhat different from the first. Notably, there's no Donald J. Trump in office for the time being. And interestingly, Guterres has provided a certain kind of roadmap for what he aspires to accomplish in his second term, and that is his Our Common Agenda report, which is the product of, I think, nearly 2 years of a wide range of different kinds of consultations, including the UN75 initiative, which Natalie spearheaded. So what I'd like to ask you is, well, what do you think are some key challenges and opportunities that Guterres will be contending with, wrestling with these next 5 years? And how do you see the way forward for the Our Common Agenda report? Oh, sorry, let me start with Natalie.
Well, I think there's lots of issues that, you can pick out in terms of challenges. I think the pandemic, of course, has to be, the biggest one, because that's going to continue to have a huge impact, not just the pandemic itself, but also the issues that have made it have such a profound impact, notably, inequality and injustice. So I think for the next few years and for the, this second term, it's converting the promises, the pledges, the plans that have been made by world leaders, whether that's on vaccine equity, you could equally talk about climate justice, etc., and other challenges. That will be Guterres' sort of, I think his legacy will, whatever he, may have put out in Our Common Agenda, I think that will be his legacy and what he will be judged on, because these are the defining challenges really of this period. And of course, the other ones haven't gone away. But in terms specifically on a common agenda, I think it delivers quite a lot in terms of the vision and the language that many of us were hoping to see from Guterres in his second term. But the solutions are, very difficult and not straightforward that he puts forward. This is not a sort of a new treaty to solve X, Y, Z. He talks about a new social contract. These are concepts that are very hard to deliver in practice. So I would say there's probably 4 opportunities, all of which are pretty hard amongst the challenges. I think one is on technology. I mean, that is an area that the UN, I think, needs to get into, given its impact on, all of its work, given that is such a hard issue in terms of regulation for states at the national level, and something that has to be global. So I think the proposals around a global digital compact, looking at the whole tech space, that's something where, hopefully Guterres will be able to move the dial. Second, I think on sort of repositioning the UN in terms of providing accurate information, so important in a time of contested information, analysis and foresight. I think that is really Guterres' in a way recognition of where the UN might be able to move in the future and play a key role in advising governments. And I think in order to do that, the UN will need to step back from some of its maybe more traditional areas of work and find ways to engage civil society, foundations, private sector, regional organizations, and sort of stepping up to the plate, which I think in turn means it needs to do a lot more on advocacy and outreach. So really working with those organizations. I hope, that will be the third kind of priority for him. And finally, I think just, I hope he will use that opportunity of his second term. I mean, you mentioned the 1 for 7 billion campaign. UNA has done a lot of work around leadership at the UN and its importance, and also linked to that, the importance of, having maybe a single term for secretaries general, just so that they can have just that bit more freedom and not have to worry about reappointment. And I hope we will see that materialize in Guterres' term. And I'm not just talking about speaking out about, human rights abuses, etc., although, that would also be welcome in certainly in some situations, but also in terms of being bold in the other kinds of appointments he can make, because I think good leadership ultimately will be one of the key ingredients to transforming the organization.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, if I could actually, I'd like to maybe narrow this question down for you. One of the main things, obviously, that Guterres has been focusing on these last 5 years is the climate crisis. The most serious issue, if it can even just be called an issue, that the world faces at the moment. So how do you see that being carried forward these next 5 years? The time space that we have to make some serious changes is narrowing very quickly. So these next 5 years will be critical. And secondly, to narrow OCA, our Common Agenda report, down a little bit. I'm intrigued to hear from you, given that you've served as a vice president of the World Bank. One of the interesting or focuses in the report also has to do with cooperating more closely with international economic actors, the G20, the IMF, the World Bank. I think one of the proposals is like a biennial summit with ECOSOC and these other institutions. So yes, two questions: A, on climate change, and B, on global economic governance and our common agenda.
Thanks, Dali. And look, the Common Agenda report is a very well-written report. And a lot of people have observed that, while also scratching their heads to remember what it says after a bit, because, you know, it's had huge difficulty despite all the effort that went into it, the smart ideas that brim over from it, really getting very much traction amongst governments. And, you know, I think that is the challenge for the contemporary UN. It is, as Joseph, the former Rwandan ambassador, observed in the first half of this, you know, multilateralism's in a bad way at the moment. And so you can have a Secretary General and a team that come up with some great ideas, but there's a gap between that and implementation, which is, I think, obvious to everybody. And if I take the two issues that you particularly referenced, I mean, on climate change, this was the Secretary General who came in anticipating that he was going to be a throwback to a much more traditional sort of conflict mediation world chief diplomat Secretary General, found he could make no progress on that, you know, humiliated, in fact, by the way he was brushed aside on quite a few disputes, and then sort of rediscovers his predecessor's priority, climate change. And I think he's done a perfectly solid job on it, but he's not overcome the fact that the whole COP process is not getting us there. It's just not getting us there. Now, you know, it's possible that in a kind of evolutionary way, the growing role of corporates or of different coalitions of the willing, you know, in a sense, convert COP from the inside, and there is a sort of organic growth where it moves from being this laborious effort to get universal agreement on things to a platform for public-private coalitions who seize particular goals, methane or renewables conversion or whatever, or financing of renewables. And maybe it'll get there, but there's no frankly obvious lead from the UN to do that. It will happen if, you know, the UN's convening power, to quote you from earlier, provides a forum on which some clever people take advantage and build these kinds of coalitions. And, you know, turning to your second one, the economic piece, yeah, I'm not particularly, you know, to be honest, when I was administrator of UNDP and then Deputy Secretary General, you know, I tried to organize for ECOSOC meetings with the World Bank and international financial institutions, and it was, you know, two languages talking past each other, the sort of, you know, the very wordy language of diplomats up against the much more quantitative language of finance ministry officials who tend the World Bank and the IMF, and it just never quite connected. And I don't really see that changing. And in fact, I mean, to be honest, I see the IFIs as at the moment having some advantage in keeping some distance from the UN system, because I think they're more likely to get some of the reforms they need if they can stay away from the political limelight of the UN and the General Assembly and the Security Council, and find an opportunity in the background for the Chinese and Americans to share some work together on how these institutions can better serve global prosperity or a greener world, which are issues which both countries have a common interest in, and stay away from the limelight and highly politicized atmosphere of the UN. So, you know, I think it's a mixed field. I think these are the kinds of issues Guterres is right to focus on, but I'm not yet convinced he's finding a kind of plausible leadership strategy or voice on them.
Thank you very much, Mark. So now we'll be moving to questions from participants. Again, I encourage everybody to ask questions. Also, I saw that there were some interesting questions in the previous panel which didn't get asked because of time constraints. So if you'd like to pose that question to Natalie or Mark, you're most welcome to repost your question. So I'll start first of all with Nudara Yusuf and Catherine Marshall, if they could come up on the screen, and if they could also, would be great if you could quickly state your affiliation before asking your question. So Nudara, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much, Dali, and thank you, Natalie and Lord Malek Brown as well for your interesting contributions. And for being so honest about it as well. I do appreciate that this was a very frank panel, which is refreshing and great. So my question is, with regards to the OCA report, and Natalie, you've spoken previously as well about making the report land. Now, whilst there is, UNA UK and several other civil society organizations have this as a kind of a priority agenda, are really thinking about the advocacy tools behind making this OCA report land, I kind of work with these organizations, but also within the UNDP. And within the UN system, there just seems to be a reluctance to be a part of this conversation. They have their own deadlines, their own kind of outputs that they're working towards. And even working within the Strategic Foresight Unit, which Natalie, as you mentioned, is such a big part of the OCA report, there's a reluctance to get the Our Common Agenda a part of the conversation. So my question is to both of you, given that you've worked both within the UN system itself and in the regime complex that surrounds the UN system, how does one, and is there a role civil society plays in making the OCA report land, not just with member states and potentially with kind of local organizations, but within the UN agencies themselves?
And Catherine, please.
Catherine Marshall, now at Georgetown University, formerly World Bank. I'd be interested in hearing your comments on the refugee forced migration issues and where you see that going, including adding the question of climate refugees and how the UN system might work in relation to some of the other decision-making bodies.
Let's go to Mark first.
Okay. Well, look, both very good questions. I would say to Nudara that, I had the pleasure of sort of being one of those involved in creating the Millennium Development Goals. They weren't mine, but orchestrating their presentation and at the beginning there was massive rejection across the UN system of them, including by my own UNDP, but people were extremely snooty about them, and there was a lot of just kind of persistence and not giving up on them. And now many of what gives me particular pleasure is some of the individuals who were most resistant at the beginning now are professors of MDGs at different institutions. So something went right, and have entirely forgotten their early opposition to them. But the one thing that, the MDGs were actually a product of the wider Millennium General Assembly report. And people don't remember the wider report, although it had, like this one, lots of great things in it, like, in that case, a universal agreement to democracy as the preferred form of government, which China and others all signed up to in 2000. But until you boiled it down into a crib sheet of a handful of things to get done, the world couldn't get its head around it. And I think that is, a simple communications problem for this report. There's too much there. There needs to be a process of simplification and prioritization, and then a campaign around that, rather than just presenting the whole menu to the world. On Catherine, and nice to see you, Catherine, on your question, I struggle with whether the UN is going to recover its place in leadership around refugees and migration. I mean, the history of 20th century migration goes from the foundation of first the Nansen Organization and the World Refugee Organization, and then subsequently UNHCR, being around Europe handling the massive displacement of 2 world wars and being a champion of asylum and protection. But it ended in Europe betraying all of that in the crisis of Syria and Central Asia. And so, you know, Europe went from the champion of this agenda to its betrayer. And, you know, at the same time, what was, you know, war displacement with a finite end to it, you know, has become a much bigger socioeconomic, political, economic process of, you know, differential birth rates in different halves of the world, differential economic growth rates in different halves of the world, and completely opposite demographies in 2 halves of the world, an aging north, a younger south, particularly Africa, Middle East, and some regions of that kind. And the traditional, and this will only be, and these pressures which are generating massive migration as well as refugee movements are only going to be enhanced by climate refugees, evidently. And I simply do not think we anymore have the kind of enlightened structure which either represents the foresight point that over time the countries of the North are going to be demographically challenged and need more people to come, or you know, the challenges of today with these brutal sort of politics of migration walls to keep people out. I simply don't think at the moment we have the sort of official multilateral leadership or engagement between states to solve this. So I anticipate that the original thinking on refugees and migration is going to come out of civil society and only slowly get mainstreamed into governments and the multilateral system, because, you know, the ideas are just simply too bold and too brash for the caution of a broken multilateral interstate system to accept at the moment. You know, we're not going to solve this global migration crisis through sort of modest incremental steps.
I think I totally agree with that. I mean, I was in New York at the UN around, you know, the debates around the Global Compact, you know, on safe, orderly, regular migration and on refugees. And, you know, there was, it was such a sort of toxic debate. And this is a little bit, you know, the comment I made about you don't have these straight lines anymore, but dividing the sort of the good guys, bad guys, if you could say that at the UN. I mean, we had so much opposition from so many member states, and member states were very happy to hide behind other member states to block progress on this issue. And there are not many people I talk to who feel like now is the time to be revising the hard-won and often ignored international laws we already have to expand to include climate migrants and refugees. And, you know, it breaks my heart. I mean, half my family are refugees, and even them with a very sort of clear-cut political threat conflict situation. I've had a tough time getting out. But I do think this is one area, perhaps like climate change, where local governments, you know, cities, communities, that the leadership can come from them, because they are actually the ones who can hopefully, you know, make a difference, lobby, look after people, take in people, you know, lead by example, and do that kind of longer work that will be needed to change what has become such a toxic narrative. And you know, it really depresses me that in this country too, you have a narrative almost about development that is about, look, we need development to keep people out, and that's somehow seen as okay because at least we get development. On Nadara's question, I think it's really difficult. We were so excited about UN75, went to all our colleagues and thought, look, we have this wonderful opportunity, this consultation, and everyone just basically told us to go away. And I think part of the problem is, you know, everything that Mark, described and talked about in terms of the way, the UN works, but also I think sometimes, you know, these initiatives, not enough thought is given to how they're communicated. That's a big problem. You know, you have this very, very long report with lots of recommendations. What on earth do you do with that? but B, I think also the planning stages. If something is going to be a big initiative, UN75 and this report that came out of it, a lot could have been done by senior leaders coming together early on and saying, this is an opportunity, it's an advocacy opportunity, it's an outreach opportunity. We might also be able to move the dial in some countries on certain issues if we do this well. But of course, that wasn't that. It was a sort of initiative that sort of evolved and, and was rushed out. And now, the heavy lifting that could have been a lot lighter had it been done before is going to be a lot heavier. But I think that, there are opportunities if and when the Secretary General with member states and others sort of agree on which parts of this report are actually going to be the ones to focus on. And I very much hope civil society and engagement will be part of that, and the digital and some of the other issues I mentioned. I think once that's been crystallized, then you have much more of an opportunity to do that internal and external sales pitch, and civil society, which can move between these constituencies without the constraints, will be crucial.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Nudara. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Mark, obviously. So look, we've only got 5 minutes left, but I do think we should really get some other questions in there. So I'm going to ask everybody to be extremely telegraphic. We've got 5 minutes. So next, Hugh Milner and Tom Gilbert. So please be brief in those questions, and our panelists, please be brief in the answers. And I think it would also be best if these questioners ask their question to just a single person. And that should get us within the 5 minutes. So please, first, Hugh Milner.
Good evening. Sorry, I think I've come off. Lord Malek Brown, we met in an earlier evolution in New York, in the UN, and some of the instances we're working on within the Darfur planning team of 2006, seeing a slight reflection of nostalgia to what's going on in the situation in Iran of today, where the President Raisi is an alleged criminal of some fairly major proportions, 30,000 political prisoners being assassinated or killed in 1998. Is there anything the UN can do more to deal with crimes against humanity and genocide in what I call the modern era in which we're living? Thank you.
Marco, please go ahead. Yes.
Go ahead on it. Okay. Well, look, I think President Raisi is a bad guy. There's no doubt about that. I think the 1998 killings, I'm not sure whether they can directly be laid, at his feet or not. You may know better than me, but he obviously has only been head of state for the last 6 months or so. But we're in a chronic crisis for this kind of international accountability and justice. The International Criminal Court hangs on by a thread. The efforts that we made in those days that you refer to with Darfur to, both, engage the international justice system, to employ the Security Council in support of it, all those seem very distant days ago compared to now. And, I think we've seen an extraordinary rise of impunity, both domestically and internationally. And my own thought is there's not very much the UN can do, but there's an awful lot that civil society could do. And I think, one characteristic of these kinds of leaders is they tend to have large fortunes outside the country. I doubt that in the case of an Iranian president, it's in the UK, but that makes him the exception rather than rule, because most of the world's autocrats comfortably keep their monies in London, happily served by London law firms, bankers, accountants, public relations firms, the lot. And my own view is that civil society in places like Britain have to kind of take the law into their own hands more. We've got to raise the cry about human rights generally, but around these sort of specific abuses in particular, and find the pain points. It may have been a human rights abuse, but go after their money, go after their homes in Hyde Park Corner or wherever it is. And, let's introduce a new era of that kind of direct civil society press for the accountability of human rights. You know, the great revival of post-World War II of human rights came from organizations like Amnesty International, you know, individuals writing letters about prisoners of conscience. We need to go back to some similar models of human rights citizen activism.
Very much indeed.
Thank you, Mark. And personally, completely agree with you. And often when I read about some grand civil society campaigns of the past, namely the movement against apartheid in South Africa, I wonder, why can we not seem to muster that kind of singular, visionary, global mobilization? So thank you very much for that point. Excuse me, I see now that the other person who was meant to ask a question unfortunately cannot be here. In any case, we have actually reached the scheduled end of this panel. So I'm going to end it here. And well, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Natalie, for sharing these insights. I think that both of you have a particular strength, which is that not only are you incredibly well informed about all these things and incredibly experienced, you're also very happy to share your insights, and that is appreciated. So next, I guess final remarks by Lord Wood. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Hi there, I hope you can hear me. Dali, thank you very much for chairing that session. I found both panels in very different ways stimulating. The first looked more at the recipes of success and failures of the past, and the need to maintain the spirit and the organization that has served the UN so well. The panel that Natalie and Mark have just run has really been quite eye-opening for me, because it's been very candid, as Dali says, about the problems that the UN has, about the fact there is nothing inevitable either about UN decline or UN success, that it needs to be made anew by each generation, and with a more civil society-centered way of conceiving of international cooperation now. So thank you to all the participants, and thank you all for taking part. I just want to say a few words about Natalie, who's leaving this week. We're going to miss her hugely as the CEO of UNA UK. Not just because she leaves UNA UK transformed compared to a decade ago in terms of financial stability, in terms of its reputation internationally, and not just because of her extraordinary skills, her ability to turn from policy wonk to campaign coordinator to expert pundit with the drop of a hat, and not just because of the way she's led a team that has put UNA UK at the centre and often at the head of international coalitions in the NGO world that have changed the way that the UN works, and showing the way towards a more civil society-oriented model for thinking about change internationally. And not just because she's held in such high regard at all levels of the UN family, from the Secretary General's office to the branches of our own UNA UK. But on top of all this, we're going to miss Natalie because she has shown how to be a leader of an organization in a way that inspires, that is based on values and principle, and yet also treats people inside and outside the organization with enormous respect. And I've learned a huge amount watching her combine these skills of leadership. I'm sure of two things. One is that she will excel in her new role at OSF, and that secondly, UNA UK will keep inviting her back as a guest speaker for events like this. And moral pressure means it's going to be very difficult for her to say no. So thank you, Natalie, so much, and good luck. And that just leaves me to thank the excellent panelists we've had again, to thank you all for tuning in and for all your questions and excellent comments. I'm sorry to those of you who didn't get replies. And to leave you with one final short video from UNA UK, which poses the question, what will you do to help make the difference that we all need? Thank you very much. Happy New Year, and see you soon.